enjoyed reading it more than the last one that I presented on, just as a disclaimer, because I thought he was a very good writer. So it starts off, basically the whole general, like, put it into one sentence, is just talking about the controversy of, does Lobkazan, did he basically just copy Beethoven's Ninth, and is that it, or like, is there more to it? And that's just the general overview. So it really goes into a lot of, so the first, like, I would say half is about talking about different critiques and comparing them. So when some people are saying like, oh, he stole the structure, which means it's very similar. So this, because they do have the same 3 instrumental movement followed by the chorus structure. So I think that's the first thing that people are like, oh, they're the same then, which I disagree with, but we'll get to that. And then he introduces the idea of this like inner necessity, which took me, I think that's it's a little hard because he never really explains quite what he means by the phrase inner necessity, which is something I'll ask later. Like, so to me, I took it to mean inner necessity within the community of music. Like, so I took it to mean like, why do we need 2 of the same symphony within this community of music? And that's the main argument. A lot of people who are con to the Lobkazan are like, why do we need 2 of them? Why'd you make another one? We have one, it's Beethoven, who is like the best, which is where the whole Icarus thing comes from, is like, Beethoven is the sun, Mendelssohn flew too close, that kind of thing. But then someone else said, the structure is the same, but the inner details are not, which I personally agree with, especially once we get into the second half of the reading. And then there's another one they talk about how people who praise the symphony, and apparently it was still really well liked in its time, just don't even acknowledge that there was any similarities between Beethoven's Ninth and the Lobkazan, which I also don't agree with, because I think the parts that he took from Beethoven's Ninth is integral to creating the Lobkazan. So I think it's okay to like take the structure, be inspired by certain aspects, as long as you make it your own, which I think he did. I'm inserting my opinion a lot. And so I don't think it's wise that the people who support the Mendelssohn just ignore it or don't talk about the similarities at all. And then they kind of discuss some of the main differences, which would be that, say, Mendelssohn's text comes from the Bible or Psalms, and Beethoven's Ninth was from poetry, so that's a big difference. And I personally think the themes are kind of different in that Mendelssohn's is a lot more based on praise and worship, whereas I think Beethoven's was a lot more thematic and poetic and conceptual, if that makes any sense. Although they do both kind of feature a theme of like light versus dark, I think, their own interpretations of that. So that was a cool concept that they brought up that I thought was an interesting similarity they kind of hold. In addition, Mendelssohn's apparently was quite interesting because he had through composed the first 3 instrumental movements, whereas Beethoven had like breaks, which was the standard, I suppose, of symphonies, which was another difference. And I think that was an interesting move on Mendelssohn's part, just because to make it flow in one continuous thing, like that's a long time to be listening to different themes develop, but I also think it's cool because it like links together. But on that note, he was criticized for not melding the instrumental section well with the voice section. And like a critique that they had in this section was that the voice section didn't seem to relate to the instrumental section at all. So it was just kind of random, which is why people are like, oh, he was obviously copying Beethoven because he just added this voice section that doesn't seem to relate to anything, which is a fair argument. So I do get that. And then there was they had a critic called Riemann. I think it'd be Riemann because the E. Anyway, who is the one that said like it basically doesn't unite the 2 ideas, but I think at the end he had written that it says that there are still things that Mendelssohn took from the Beethoven's Ninth that he believes that he improved upon. So it's not a waste if he fills in the deficiencies of Beethoven's Ninth, which I thought was an interesting concept because, again, it's kind of like remaking a movie. Like, if you remake it and do it better than the original, which doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, then like no one should be mad, right? Someone will be mad, but like you know. And then if you remake it and it's terrible, people will be like, oh, whatever, it was just terrible, we'll ignore it, don't listen to the remake, you know, like Disney's been doing a lot.
That's a good.
Anyway.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, I plan on talking about that in the little essay, but I watch a lot of movies, so a lot of my analogies are movie related. So then the second half, which I thought was very fascinating to read, was talking about like the Gutenberg Festival, which is what he wrote it for. And I learned all this stuff I didn't know about how like Gutenberg was seen as like a very prominent German national figure, because he, I think they said, let me find the quote because I thought it was really beautiful. The creation of movable type was a big deal because they saw it as a way of spreading the word of God to as many people as possible. And the quote I really liked was, Gutenberg's invention was not the light itself, but the lamp that carries the light and makes it visible to a wider circle, which I thought was so well worded. And because of that, Gutenberg was seen as a very prominent German national figure, and they had this festival every year in honor for him. And that the one for 1840 is the one that Mendelssohn wanted to write this piece for, which is why it figures so prominently on Bible verses and also light versus dark, because this is the celebration of light getting spread across the world and using the biblical passage, which was the whole point of movable type. So I think that ties in really well. And also it seems that like he pulled from a lot of German influences specifically for the Lobgesang, especially they mention a lot about the Protestant chorale, which are two things that are very unique to the Lobgesang, I believe. And when reading the second half, I was like, there's so much like uniqueness to the Lobgesang that I find it funny that people just dismiss it immediately as being a copy of Beethoven's Ninth, because I don't super agree. And I think it really gets into the discussion of like imitation versus inspiration, which will be one of my questions. But especially in this half, I think it points out to all of the very unique elements that the Lobgesang has. And let's see, hold on. Oh yeah, someone said it was kind of like a tribute to a lot of different genres, because he pulled from like Bach, Protestant music. There's a section that references how there's some aspects of Schubert symphony hidden in there, as well as like German traditional music and some Handel like counterpoint going on in some certain sections. And there's a lot of like influences he takes from a lot of different people, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you're supposed to be inspired by your predecessors, and I think it's cool. And especially when you think of like, you know, a medley of sorts, or just combining all these things to make one new thing, I think is pretty cool. And especially that it incorporates like German folk song into it, which is significant to the use in the festival, which probably made everyone very happy who were at the festival. And so I just think that maybe it was very significant to the German people, but outside of that, like scholars or whatever, people are gonna like heavily criticize it. And from what it seems, the people who are mostly dismissing it as a copy of Beethoven Ninth are people who were not there when it was premiered, and especially who were not like at the festival and of that culture, I would say, because it seems like they are dismissing the fact that it was of much cultural significance to these people and therefore unique in its own right.
Yeah, you're seeing it out of context.
Yeah, I did write that. I said timing. Yeah. Because if Beethoven's Ninth hadn't just happened, like no one would say anything. And so, and yeah, it seems like most of the people who are critiquing it, again, are just musicologists looking at it in the past, not people who were there. And yes, there were critiques of it, of people at the time who were there, but most of them were not at that festival, I would say, from what I know, or seemed to be looking at it in a much more critical and analytical side, rather than like the deep richness of the cultural side. So there's that. Which I think is a good example of how, like, when you look something from far away, you're like, yeah, can see two things and they'll look really similar, but like if you get really close, they're not. You know. And I think that was most of it, because the second half was mostly just talking about that. I'm trying to find my last note. About how, like, some people may say, like, oh, which I do think is interesting, he didn't quite know what it was going to turn into until rather close to the festival itself. Like, he had a lot of the parts written, but wasn't sure, like, of the structure, because they wanted an oratorio. But he was like, I don't know about that. And he kind of didn't quite know the structure it was going to take place with, which you could say, like, in that instance, maybe he did not steal, but think Beethoven's ninth structure. He was just getting down to a point where he's like, I can't decide what to make this. Let me just use this structure. Like, it could have definitely been that, because he was a little down to the wire in putting it all together. But there's nothing wrong with that, you know. He just needed a little format, and that's okay. So it came together, and also I think it said right here that with his, like, terms with the festival committee, there had to be a choral part. I think that's what it did, right? So, like, he had to add it.
It's important to know that this is 1840. In 1836, he wrote his oratorio St. Paul, which became very, very popular. And so Mendelssohn was known for this kind of writing. So it was kind of up to him to bring something like that to the fore.
Yeah. So it kind of makes sense that, given he had these parameters to go and kind of a time crunch, that he would turn to Beethoven's ninth as a structure, especially because it was so wildly popular and well received, that he was like, well, I'm just going to use this because it worked for him, so it'll work for my piece as well. And so, again, that kind of brings me to, like, the question of, like, imitation versus inspiration. But it seems like they have very significant differences that just, like, some people are like, oh, they have the same structure, so he stole it. And I think that he generally ends his writing by saying it's pretty different, you know, despite, like, critiques. And what he said, the structural parallels between the opening movements and the instrumental sections are very striking, and that it's very effective, and that the final movements are presented in recapitulation ideas. So I think he's saying that it all ties together well. So yeah, that's the summary. I liked his writing. I found it very interesting, especially the second half. And I think he did a good job of, like, introducing the argument of the opposing side in a very effective way by, like, having all these different criticisms. And I think he did a good job of presenting all the sides of the argument before, like, kind of inserting his own idea and giving it a lot of background. But I still think at the end he remained rather neutral. I think he mostly was saying, like, yes, the structure is the same, but the inner details are different. But I think he did a good job of balancing all the opinions and just giving you a lot of good information about the historical background of the piece. So I actually really like reading it.
He also, when you read the title to this article, I'm sure all of us wondered what that is all about. You know, why is he comparing it to that? And you know, so this whole idea of did Mendelssohn get burned or not? You know, is a good metaphor to the whole concept that we're talking about. Yeah. So what questions do you have for us?
I have a couple. So just the first little short one. What do you think inner necessity means? Because to me, I took it to mean, like, the necessity of the piece within the community of music, but it was very vague. So I'm just curious as to see what else you guys think that means, like the words.
Okay. And I'm going to have Dylan respond to these on Thursday too. So I'm recording this, just Dylan, so that you know. Go ahead, Lily or Addie. What do you think about that?
Lily? I'm reviewing my notes. I'm looking. I wrote it down. I need to pull it up if Addie wants to go.
Go ahead, Addie.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been kind of wrestling with it, like the whole idea of inner necessity. From when I like read the assignment, I was like, what in the world are we talking about? Like, what on earth? And so like I still don't know if I have like a clear definition, just because it wasn't expounded on a lot. And like that's still something that like I'm trying to formulate for the answer for the little paper. But I like that idea of like it's not, we already have one, so why do we need another one? Like the whole remake idea. Like that's very interesting, and I hadn't thought of it like that. I was thinking inner necessity in the sense of like more within the work itself and not within the context of the musical culture as a whole. If that makes sense. So like there were things missing maybe from Mendelssohn that Beethoven had. Maybe it was that sublime factor that Beethoven's work had that Mendelssohn didn't necessarily have, because he talks about that later in the article about how like some of the critics were saying that, oh no, Mendelssohn connects it better, like the voices to the orchestra. But it was talking about how Marx said that the whole premise and like the whole idea for Beethoven incorporating the choral and like the aspect of it and the voices was to shock you. Like it wasn't connected on purpose. So maybe like these little details and contrast.
Good. This whole idea of inner necessity is kind of mind-boggling at first. You kind of think about it more, but it makes you think about it. And I also put that idea of growth in the Schmerg analysis, because inner necessity might have something to do with that as well. About it. Lily, you want to add something to that?
What I could find is that inner necessity is the quality of authentic justification. So what I took from that was like the inner like movement within like the impact of the work itself, like within the work. So like the sublime elements and stuff is what I was thinking as. But I definitely like the idea of the growth element as being the inner necessity.
Yeah, good. Christine, does that get at what you're thinking about?
Yeah, definitely give me some new ideas. So that's good.
Yeah.
And then the other one is like, what do you think like the line between imitation and inspiration is? Because that's something I thought was a big theme of this writing and a big theme of the controversy itself.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting how like our culture has changed when it comes to like imitating, and like, you know, now you have people are like, oh, it's my song, like copyright, you know, like pop music culture, things like that. It's like people are constantly getting in trouble for copying other people's works. But I mean, earlier and like in classical music, sometimes like it was an honor like to have your music represented, like someone loved it enough to use it within their own work. So I just think it's interesting how that culture has kind of flipped and changed.
Yeah.
So, but I think for the time being, I like that he paid tribute almost to these different composers. At first, when I was reading the article, I was like, oh yeah, like that's copying, whatever. And then like once he explained his like points, like, oh no, maybe he's just doing it like this. It's like, oh, that makes sense though, you know, like people did it all the time.
Yeah.
So it makes sense for that culture, like that cultural aspect in that time period, to pay tribute and not necessarily be like lazy how we would think of it now. So I think that line really is within the intention of the composer, and based on like when were they composing it, what was it for. Like he obviously used very well-known people and respected individuals, and like that takes a lot of guts to, use someone who had such great success and use that form again, because, people are going to automatically associate your
Mhm.
form with that person. But I think that takes guts to do that.
Yeah.
But so I think for the time being and under the circumstances, like, he did it well,
Yeah.
if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, it's good thoughts. Good thoughts.
Lily,
For me,
how do you come in on this?
I really like that viewpoint of like comparing the modern society versus like past
Yeah.
right? But if we're talking just about Mendelssohn's, how do you pronounce it? Logoson? How do you pronounce it? Logoson?
Lobsang.
I was looking that it's definitely he pays tribute not just to Beethoven. He includes a bunch of different composers, including like German folk songs and very well-known things. So you can see how he's taking inspiration from a lot of different avenues and not just imitating one person, and it ties into the whole, like, it's very nationalistic, like, that's what he wanted, like, it's German, like, honor, especially with the festival and how the whole piece was started. I think that shows more how he was not imitating, but honoring the different inspirations.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was certainly looking further back than just Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
But as you pointed out, Christine, earlier, it is a very German work, and the context is very German. That is for the Gutenberg Festival.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain element of nationalism in this that we'll begin to see more and more of as we go further into the 19th century.
Yeah.
Nationalism became really an issue and became a known stylistic factor with regard to composers from different countries. Any other question you have?
Yeah, just one last one. Just do you think the work stands on its own?
I think it can definitely be grouped into like a category of that, symphony cantata, but I think it's definitely very different from
Yeah.
other works as well. Yeah, there's no like the form, of course, is very similar, but it's just like how all symphonies forms are similar. It's like
Yeah.
but it's not a direct imitation from any other work.
Uh-huh.
And you mentioned, Lily, symphony cantata. When it was first written, it was going to be his second symphony. And it's still known as the Symphony Number 2, but he realized it's really a symphony cantata, whereas Beethoven's was a choral symphony.
Right.
We're dealing with apples and oranges here, but we know the significance. Addie, what do you think?
I think it definitely stands on its own. Like, I mean, like Lily said, all the forms of symphonies are the same, basically. Like, the gist of them are the same, and like that's why we call it a symphony. And so, yes, the form may have been similar, and if it had been released later or like before Beethoven's ninth, like it may not have been associated with it as much. But I think it does well in standing on its own and using different, like incorporating choral music in a different way within the instrumental music than what Beethoven did. But I think,
yeah. Good. Those are some good questions. I'm always curious whether you read the article first or listen to the music first. It can have an effect on you. If you listen to the music first and then read the article, you get other ideas. If you read the article and then wonder and listen to the music, what do you do? How have you handled that? Christine, did you listen to it first or read it?
I like to read first because there's something I'll learn or give context to that I wouldn't, or like there's points that they'll point out in the reading that I would never have noticed before going into listening. It's kind of like you read the book before you see the movie. because like that's how I see it anyway.
That's another question. Do you read the book before you see the movie, or vice versa?
Yes, original source material.
Yeah. Lily, how do you approach the works?
I also really like reading the article before listening, because then I listen with a much more like attentive ear rather than like a passive ear, you know?
Yeah.
And that's when I start to, otherwise I wouldn't really know what to listen for, I guess, you know? And it really helps to tie in together the article and the music.
Okay. And Addie, what's
That's I listen then read. Now I feel weird. Yeah, I listen then read, because like I like to have a general idea of what it sounds like, especially if I'm not familiar. Like obviously like Beethoven's Ninth, like I've heard it before, I understand what it is. Haydn's Creation, but like this I'd never heard of before, I'd never listened to it before. So it was like I needed a kind of general idea of what it sounded like before I read anything about it. And so like I like to listen so that I know what they're talking about when I read.
Also a good point.
Yeah. So you mentioned you were familiar with Beethoven 9, and most people are, because even if they don't know the work, even if they're not very savvy with regard to Beethoven, they know the tune. And as I said, I prepared Beethoven's Ninth over 123 times, but this work I've only prepared 5 times. So it kind of purports to the importance it has in today's repertory, although it's becoming more used. And I think in the future it's going to have a rebirth. You remember Mendelssohn helped to bring about the rebirth of Bach, and there's a lot of Bach, as you know, in this piece that we're going to see as well. And so this is kind of a rebirth thing happening. So Christine, it could be something in your repertoire, is what I'm saying, in terms of soprano, because you know it uses soprano, tenor, and then for your instrumentalist, it'll be something that you probably will play.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to look at now a few sections in it, and I want to talk briefly about it. You know, one of the things you want to think about is what ties this together, if anything, and that's part of the criticism that some say it doesn't tie it together. Although we do have this ya-dum ba-dum ba-da-dee da-da-da, but some feel that that was just kind of tacked on, and it doesn't have an integral part of it, much the same way as, I mean, in the same way that Beethoven's Ode to Joy is more integrated. This, we can argue, is maybe not as integrated, but what does hold it together? And what are some of the other influences we see from the work? These are rhetorical right now, but I'm going to come back to these questions. And we find some things that are very antiquated in this work, like the use of antiphony and chorales. And then we have these first 3 movements that really form a perfect symphony in itself. And then we go to the cantata. So are we attending 2 different concerts, or are we unified? Is there an inner necessity that brings us forward, so to speak? The Bonds also uses the term organic necessity, which could be a way of looking at necessity, or the growth factor that contributes to this sense of movement forward, the necessity that we feel as we move forward in this work.
Okay. Question.
Go ahead.
Could you just clarify for me a little bit what you've mentioned the growth thing a couple times, and I don't know if I just missed it, or could you just clarify what you mean by that?
That's why I introduced it now, because growth has to do with the inner necessity of a work. Is there something that brings the work unity in your own spirit that you need to go forward, or are you satisfied just listening to one movement, or are you satisfied in one section? What is it that makes the work make you connect from one section to another? That would be more of the growth factor. Certainly we have, in growth, we have form, you know, like ABA form or sonata allegro form. That doesn't always
Okay.
give us inner necessity. That gives us a structure, but it doesn't necessarily always give us a forward motion.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to play, if you have your score handy, I want you to turn to page 139. And this is a segment that we're going to listen to. It actually borders off number 6 goes into number 7. Let me just yeah,
Number 7.
we're going to discuss this in a moment. So this is on your page 139, or it might be 138 to 139. All right, let me find it. I forgot to ask, you could hear that, couldn't you? Yeah. Okay. So here we have something that you now should not mistake, except to know that that is Mendelssohnian. And remember, in the beginning of this hour, I talked about strong muscular tunes, driving dotted rhythms, singable cantabile sections, and something that launches you forward or gives you a sense of inner necessity. Okay, so we listened to it from the beginning. First of all, when you heard this opening, what came to mind? Let me just repeat just a couple of measures here that opened it. Okay, what comes to mind when you heard that? Anything familiar?
Opera.
Okay, it's very operatic. There's a drama to it.
I was looking at it like a celebration, sounds like.
Okay, so we're talking about the sound here, a celebration. Addie, what do you think?
The contrast definitely was something that I heard. The contrast between the soprano and then when the orchestra entered.
Christine, since you are a resident expert on the sublime, did sublime come to mind at all?
I mean, now that you say it, yeah. I don't just listen to music and think, oh,
Yeah.
Sublime. I mean, again, because I read the
solo singer, so all of a sudden, whack.
Yeah. It did remind, since I did the reading and then it did remind me of Zadok the Priest, which is one of my favorite pieces because I think that build-up is dope. And so that very sudden shift was very, akin to that.
Remember in Haydn's The Creation when there was light?
Yeah, oh, that's very true, very similar.
So here we have, and actually this goes from darkness. The soprano sings, "The night is departing."
Yeah.
Is departing, and all of a sudden, boom, this is the turning point in this cantata, so to speak, where we go from darkness to light.
Yeah.
You pointed out, Christine, that this light has to do with the printed word. All of a sudden, we have access to this. So we bring light to society, much the same way as Gutenberg brought light by the invention of the printing press. So I think it's a very literal turning point here, darkness to light, like we had in Haydn, and then also like we had in Beethoven. If you remember, all of a sudden, the beginning of the fourth movement, we had that, okay? So that kind of crushing turbulence has some similarities in this. We heard that in Beethoven's fourth movement twice, once at the very beginning and then once when the voices entered. And here we have it, all of a sudden the chorus enters reflecting, and the chorus is saying, the night is departing, light is coming. And then we go on from that point. Now, you might ask yourself, as we go through this movement, he changes textures. Notice what happens structurally, and does it relate to what happened at the beginning of the movement? What happens structurally in this piece, particularly when we get to, I know your score isn't measured, so that makes it difficult. I'm looking from my conducting score. But all of a sudden, when we go, we're armored with light, he breaks into counterpoint. Remember, there's a fugue that happens a little bit later in the piece. And it's a very Mendelssohnian fugue in that it has a very strong muscular feel that has these driving dotted rhythms, and it launches you forward. So does it contribute to your inner necessity? Yes, go ahead, Christine.
Well, it's funny you say that it's so Mendelssohnian because when I listened to it, I was like, oh, this is Bach. And the reason I say that is because I sang Low Bit Den Herren with my choir in undergrad, and I was like, this sounds just like it. And with the way that everything is layered, I was like, this sounds just like a Bach piece I did. So I find it funny, like, this is so Mendelssohnian because I'm like, all I'm hearing is Bach.
Let's talk about the melody. It certainly is Bachian in form.
In the weaving.
Yeah, it's not quite Bachian in the way Bach handles a melody.
Okay.
We could argue. I mean,
right, yeah.
Before. But you're right. It does remind you of Bach. And remember, Mendelssohn is the one who brought about the rebirth of Bach.
Yeah.
St. Matthew Passion that hadn't been heard in, 100 years.
Would you say the melody is distinct to Mendelssohn because of the dotted rhythms?
Yes, and so the dotted rhythm is the way he drives it forward. Bach's are, and very melodically and very cantabile way. Bach's takes a little more instrumental in the way he approaches it.
Got it.
You have sung Bach, you know that it requires a lot of thinking, whereas Mendelssohn requires thinking, but it's much more melodic and content. Lily, Addie, anything to add to that? Any thoughts?
That's a really good point. With the counterpoint and fugue and the dotted rhythm, how that all impact the structure and the colors and textures.
Yeah. And Mendelssohn also heavily uses the brass instruments.
Yeah.
Whereas Bach's use of brass instruments tend to be more ornamental or obbligato like. Excuse me.
Yeah. I just thought of Bach with a large orchestra and a choir. Like it was just Bach on steroids. Like it was this over.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I don't know. I can't think of another way. Like that's just what I heard. It was Bach on steroids.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
This part like stands out when you're listening to it.
say that again, Lily.
That this section stands out when you're listening to it with the whole.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I play this because it's probably the most important transition in the piece where we go from darkness to light. And I think we're going to look at the structure more completely on Thursday, but this is an important structural component.
I have a
yeah.
question. Do you think that was like a Beethoven-esque, like something that he took from Beethoven, like that use of contrast?
Yes, I think most definitely it is Beethovenian in that kind of contrast or that kind of shock value.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've already mentioned, as you mentioned too, it wasn't a crime to copy anybody back in this time, and it was actually quite um, quite a good thing. It brought to fore what had come before and the fact that they were giving honor and tribute to other composers. So yeah, I think it sounds Beethoven, and I think it was influenced by Beethoven. Now I'm going to go to another place, number 2, and this in your score is on page 72. Okay, now not related to your score, I'm going to play something else. So that, of course, was not Mendelssohn. But if you looked at the beginning of number 2, you could think, wow, this might sound like Mendelssohn, but it's not. Christina alluded to it before. Lily, Addie, what does this sound like to you?
In terms of the Mendelssohn, or just in general?
No, this last piece I heard, is that
Right.
I just played. Yeah.
In comparison, or just in general?
Just stylistically, do you know what it is?
I don't know who or what it is. I know I've heard it before, but it just sounds very like pure, traditionalistic. Like
Okay.
it's less regal than the.
Addie, what do you think?
I mean, it's more straightforward. It's lacking that like dotted rhythm, but it still has that big moment with the chorus. I don't know. Maybe like I want to lean towards Bach with the chords and everything, and just the way it's like lined, but it just sounds like too many instruments. I don't know.
You're close. You're close. Christine, tell us about this.
Zadok the Priest is one of the most slapping intros. I wrote a paper about it just because I love it so much. Basically, it was written for the coronation of a king for the Westminster. Don't know which one. I can't remember. But
Don't
it's
forget
written by Handel, I should say. It's Handel. Which is funny because, like, again, you would assume with Handel it'd be like very Baroque sounding and very like smaller, but it's not. So yeah, it was written for a coronation, which is why it's so like grand, and you know, there's so much build up to this beautiful chord to make it sound very. It's supposed to like I guess mimic him like walking down like Westminster Abbey, and then once he gets to the, I guess I don't know, pulpit, to like get the crown on him. The second half, I in my paper I ranted like is a disappointment compared to the beginning, just because the beginning's so epic, and then it gets very very like Handel with like a lot of counterpoint and stuff, and it's just not as fun as the beginning to me. But anyway, that's the little overview.
And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people think this is copying Handel, that Mendelssohn actually copied Zadok the Priest. Now, Mendelssohn conducted Zadok the Priest many times. And in fact, in one of the concerts that he conducted this piece, he also included Zadok the Priest, the coronation. But he wasn't trying to hide the fact. He was trying to exemplify the fact that this piece by Handel, which was used by every king, since it was written for their coronation. And the idea here is that, wow, Mendelssohn's idea was that it helps to lead into his text, which is all that hath life and breath, praise ye or sing ye to the Lord. So this is like, all that have life and breath, praise the king, but this one is praise to God. So there's a difference. There's a secular and a sacred connotation here. But the point is, as Addie said before, this sounds like Bach on steroids. You could say that this might be Handel on steroids, because it has the same shock value. And then there is also that moment of sublimity, that sublime, when the chorus just comes in and you can bumps up and down, and it brings a certain majesty to it all. So here we have Zadok the Priest, and then we have all that have life and breath, praise ye the Lord. So we have a similar kind of emotion. All right, another thing about this, there's an inner necessity here, because if you notice, is tied in here in a big way, okay? So here we have that tune, which we heard right at the beginning of the symphony, or the beginning of this whole work, whether you call it a symphony or a symphony cantata. And does this thematic connection give it the unity that some people say was not there? Or does it sound like this tune is not really integrated like it was in Beethoven, but it was um, kind of a trite addition rather than an integral part? In other words, did it really have, did it contribute to the inner necessity, or was it just an added little tune here and there that he threw in? Now you've listened to it. What do you think about that? How do you think this tune, is it really integrated, or does it come at moments that it doesn't tend to make you feel like you're driving forward in the piece? You know what I'm talking about?
It's a hard question because when listening through it, you know, your ear picks up on the you know, somatic material that keeps coming, and so that's, you know, when I was listening to it, I was like, I feel like it's unified because I am, you know, noticing the same melody throughout. But now that you're like saying that, is it actually integrated? You know, I don't know. I heard it in just the biggest moments, you know, the theme, but not so much in the other parts. So I wonder if that was on purpose or if it was just thrown in there.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing, like with Beethoven too. Like, I mean, I kind of feel the same way. It was like, up there it is. Like I hear it, like I'm listening to this. But like with the Beethoven, like the Freud theme, like you don't necessarily know you're listening to it when it happens. Like just when you hear the chorus, it's like, oh, I know that. So like you're already acquainted with it once that final movement hits, because he's used it throughout the symphony in like different kind of sly, sneaky ways.
Yeah.
So like you're already familiar, and it's I don't know. I prefer Beethoven. I think Beethoven has it better integrated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's more just like thrown in there for spice a couple times to give you something to like attach your ear to, but I wouldn't say it's like a driving thematic motive,
Right.
much like Beethoven's is, but I think it's more just like, you know, a little gesture that he throws in here and there to add some sort of connectivity.
Yeah, and you guys are getting at it really well. Beethoven uses structure, uses form to integrate his ideas. He'll use a little motive, and you'll hear it. I mean, you'll see it in the score, but you might not necessarily hear it. And so he's tricking you into it. He's building it into your psyche that you're gonna remember this, and it's gonna give it that inner necessity. But I can't criticize Mendelssohn, because Mendelssohn was not Beethoven. Mendelssohn didn't use structure like Beethoven did. Mendelssohn used melody. He used tunes, because that's what he was most well known for, and that's specifically what gives his music the integrity it has. So the overall question here in this inner necessity is, Mendelssohn isn't Beethoven, but is Mendelssohn in his own way giving unity and concept of inner necessity in this piece, much the same way Beethoven did in the other? We can prefer one or the other. The subtleties of Beethoven and the way he uses form so intricately, or the obvious big tunes that Mendelssohn throws at you. He almost punches you with it.
Mm-hmm.
You hear that? There's no question about it. So for the average listener, there's probably more connection here than maybe even in the Beethoven. When we think of movement 1, 2, and 3 in the Beethoven, it's hard to connect it thematically sometimes, but it's not so hard to connect it thematically here because of the big Mendelssohnian tunes. Would you agree? You think you understand how that's moving? Yeah.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, so when when Mendelssohn writes a chorus, I want to look at these and see what, how does Mendelssohn use these choruses by going backward. Of course, when he uses a chorus, he always has a fugue in there or some kind of a fugal motion, much exactly the same way as Handel and of course Bach. But Mendelssohn fuses these with these concepts I talk about. So how can you distinguish a Mendelssohn chorus from a Beethoven or a Haydn or, you know, or a Handel or Bach, going back even further, although we're not studying Handel and Bach. We can certainly go back to Haydn and see some parallels. So I'm going to play another section. We're going to talk about the choral ideas here. Wait a minute. Okay, this is in on your page 164, number 8. Your page 164. Okay, let's talk about first the opening that I played, which essentially is a chorale. And here we have a chorale which is unaccompanied. Now, if I played this for you, you would probably think, who, right away? What composer? Well, you probably, Bach would have to come to mind. at one point or another because of the use of the chorale. So, and it's almost inseparable. If I played that for you and you said, well, that's Bach, or that's a chorale from the Reformation, you know, that would be right. You wouldn't say that was Mendelssohn because that tune was not Mendelssohn specifically. But this Nun Dankit Allegat, if you were a German and you were living in the year 1824, you would feel a sense of national spirit because this tune was so well known with regard to the German Protestantism, which most of Germany fell into. And then all of a sudden, when we got to the next page, I think you're 165, what's happening here? What's the format here? What do you think? Christine?
Sorry, I'm trying to find the page. My
160.
forehead to like reload.
Oh. Addie, what do you think?
Why I looked panicked.
Because the instruments come in here, so what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, you have this line in the upper instruments, but then you have this like rolling timpani in the background that leads to this forte moment when the chorus re-enters.
Okay, so we got pedal point going on, we've got figuration going on in the instruments, and then when the chorus comes in, what are they
The
singing?
organ.
Yeah, and the organ, but they're singing, and the organ is like playing the hymn like you would in church. They're singing once again the you know, the same tune, and so this tune is kind of like a cantus firmus here, in that it's the tune we had. It's in unison. It's reinforced with the organ, but the instruments are playing something completely different. Now this is completely Bachian concept. In fact, it is called a chorale prelude in Baroque music, and particularly in Baroque organ music and the organ music of Bach. But he uses it in his cantatas as well as in his passions, that is Bach. And this cantus firmus idea or chorale prelude harkens back. It's almost like an exact copy of Bach, except as you said before, Addie, it's like Bach on steroids in that look at all the instruments. It's got flutes and oboes and clarinets, an entire string section, and then he's got the pedal point timpani doing a roll all the way through it, and then the organ comes in. So it's a very almost liturgically liturgical feeling you have that comes to mind, especially if you were a Lutheran German at this time in history. And so again, Mendelssohn here is using the past, especially the references to Bach, to bring this sense of German nationalism, German pride that was part of this anniversary of the 400th anniversary of the Gutenberg invention of the printing press. So this is pretty significant stuff as we think about it. And I want to, as you are writing about your inner necessity here, some of these things that we talked about today can certainly come into your ideas, I think, and I hope it gave you some more light in terms of inner necessity and absolute necessity and comparison of the past. So for Wednesday, you're probably still in the process of writing your essay. But Wednesday, we're going to talk about your ideas in this essay and how
You mean Thursday, right?
I mean Thursday.
Yeah, it's put in the paper and I got concerned. I was like,
No.
Thursday.
So yeah, Thursday. And
Okay.
and then I'm going to play a little give you a little listening test on Thursday, not to be counted, but future ones will be. I want to go back to, you know, your recognition of Haydn, your recognition of Beethoven, and your recognition of Mendelssohn. because they all begin to tie together as we move further. And then next week, particularly as we go to the oratorios. So let me see, what else do I need to tell you about Wednesday? So Lily, you're going to be, the reading that is also on is the Mendelssohn reading that Lily's going to talk about, right, Lily? So everybody reads the Sposato. I moved that up to this week so that we could talk a little bit more about Mendelssohn as well. And then I'm also on Wednesday Thursday, going to talk a little more about research and about you begin thinking about your term paper, because I never think it's early enough in the semester, especially in an academic course like this, a musicological course like this, that you need to think about your research and what direction you want to take with your eventual term paper. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in relation to Turabian. And I just want to get you thinking ahead. All right, any questions? So we got that recorded. Dylan, you've got all of that. So I'm going to stop the recording and I'll send it to you somehow. I'm not sure how to do